Good morning, everyone. I'll take advantage of this moment of quieting of the room to welcome everyone to our second day of the Unfolding Symposium and Workshop. Some of you are joining us today, maybe for the first time. Many of you were here yesterday. And my name is Francesca Casadio. I'm the Granger Executive Director of Conservation and Science here at the Art Institute, and it is our absolute pleasure to have such a great attendance to this second iteration of our time-based media symposia and workshops. I hope everybody had a good evening, and that some of you had a chance to enjoy Alexandra Bassett's performance, Chasing a Ghost, curated by Hendrik Folkert. And if not, you still have a chance both tonight and tomorrow. This conference is so much about unfolding processes and practices in contemporary art, as it is about intersections and collaborations. And I hope that all of you have realized how tremendously interdisciplinary both the panels and the organizers have been in putting together this conference. It's quite rare to have artists, curators, conservators, technicians, other museum practitioners, collectors in the same room. And I think that you would all agree that this brings a different richness to the conversation. Yesterday, we kicked off to a great and energizing start. Jacqueline Stewart of the Southside Home Movie Project talked about the power of video to activate memories. And Abina Manning, on the subject of memory, also mentioned how some of the Video 3X artists had conflicting memories of their own videos, and how important it was for the Video Data Bank to, in fact, equip what we could call a time-based media preservation lab to actually migrate some of these videos and allow everybody to access this content through Video Data Bank, and also, in a sense, to reactivate those memories that were lost. And then, certainly very touching to me personally, how Liz Johnson-Arthur reflected profoundly on the archive. An archive, she said, is something that keeps things and keeps them important. And how, for her, archive has to do with accessibility, but she also mentioned this word, fragility, and how fragility is something that, for her, as an artist, is extremely exciting, but where she also realizes that this fragility poses risks, and that she wants her archives to survive. She also said that, as an artist, she has no interest in doing that work, that their work should be done by an institution and done by others. And so I want to take a moment then to celebrate those who actually do this work, the conservators, the AV technicians, the installation specialists, who make this work exhibitable and preserve it in our collection. Of course, the role of the curator, of the artist, of the collector, they're so visible, we all realize them. But it's certainly important to celebrate also the often behind-the-scene work of all those professionals that keep those memories so that they can be reactivated whenever we want. And the Art Institute, you have met some of our own colleagues and experts. I also want to acknowledge those conservation, time-based media conservation experts that we rely on in our own practice, and consultants that guide us in our own time-based media initiative. And we have two in the room that you will hear and learn from today, Jeff Martin and Ben Finoradin and Erin Barson, who are here to share their knowledge with all of us. I think that you will all agree that having Beryl talk to us was extremely powerful. And also, to me, it was very interesting when she said that going to a multiple channel work for her as an artist would force people to go into a public space, to view the work. And so this is important, again, of the public space and the institution, the role of the institution for this work. And I want to point out that while the Art Institute as an institution has been collecting time-based media artworks since the 60s, it's only a couple of years that we've had a robust and interdisciplinary time-based media stewardship initiative internally. And we took very seriously this role as an institution that has resources, to make sure that in opportunities like today, we could share those resources with colleagues from many other institutions and professionals in the Midwest, but also we have some guests that come even farther away. And this is what, for us, the Midwestern Media Arts Consortium is about. And I want to emphasize that, in fact, some of you who gave us your feedback after last year's Unfixed symposium, your feedback actually was instrumental in shaping the events and the panels and the activities that you'll see today. And so as a last thing, I would like, in fact, to that note, to remind all of you, please to fill the surveys that you have in your packets and hand them at the front desk, because really the strength of this initiative and the fact that we can bring these resources here in our region draws just from all your ideas and needs and thoughts, and we're so grateful that you're here to share those with us, because we're really all learning together, and I think it's always a good day when we learn something new. So I'm happy that we can be here all together. And without further ado, then I would like to leave the podium to Hendrik Folkert and Jordan Carter, who will kick off with our first panel. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is has coffee and is caffeinated. I would actually ask to maybe for everyone to join me on the stage. Our speakers, Trajal, Larry, Johanna, and Jordan, of course. We can sit here. Well, here we are. Good morning again. Very happy to see a full room for the second day of this symposium unfolding. My name is Hendrik Folkert. I'm the curator of contemporary art at the Art Institute of Chicago. Together with Jordan at the end of the table, we're going to be moderating the panel that talks about commissioning. And maybe just to kind of at the start of that, like, what are we speaking about when we talk about commissioning? I think in the core of it, I want to identify commissioning as a process and practice in which an artist and the people they are working with are invited by an institution or an exhibition to make a new work, and arguably like specifically for a certain site or a certain situation. And of course, the history of commissioning is long, and you can kind of like sort of draw it back to kind of like Mecenas type of situations of sort of the church and the state sort of commissioning artists to make certain works. And one could really go into art history of that. But with the rise and kind of like establishment of the modern art institution, and certainly in the past like sort of 25 years, I would like to argue, commissioning has become also really institutional practice. We see it in like exhibitions, large-scale exhibitions, like biennials, but also museums, art institutions. Artists are more and more invited to either like respond to something, a certain site, a certain situation, a space, a place, a time, or artists are invited into an sort of an institution to create a new work. This also for us, this sort of panel doesn't come out of the blue. As Francesca was saying in her introduction, yesterday evening and still this evening and tomorrow, you could enjoy a new performance by Alexandra Barsetsis, Chasing a Ghost. And this is part of a multi-year sort of series, if you will, of new performance commissions, in which we indeed invite artists to take a walk with us through the Art Institute, look at several like spaces, select one, and kind of not necessarily always respond to that space, but make a new work in that space, anchored in, let's say, all the variances of performance that there are, sound, choreography, spoken word, whatever that artist is doing at that moment. And so iterations, and actually, many other things at the Art Institute, because iterations is not the only sort of instance where we ask artists to make a new work, has become sort of a catalyst to thinking about, okay, what does this mean for us to commission artists? Because in an ideal scenario, let's sort of sketch that out first, commissioning is a process of reciprocal learning, I want to say, where sort of an institution and the people working in them has an opportunity to learn what it means to host that artist work, and for the artist and the people they are working with to kind of understand what it means to work in a certain site, in a certain space, etc., etc. Also for the audience, of course, it's an opportunity to learn always about an artist's work and how it's sort of shown somewhere. And it often kind of highlights moments of like site specificity, which will always definitely go into the panel. So that's the ideal scenario. In reality, it's also a space of like boundaries sometimes. When you invite an artist into your space, you would like to make everything a possibility. We all know that is not always the case, right? There are certain like boundaries, and this is where sort of commissioning becomes extra interesting for me. Like, what are those boundaries, and what are sort of the agencies that an artist has, a person in an institution has, an audience has in relationship to this process of commissioning. And I maybe just want to highlight at the MCA last weekend, there was also a very interesting conversation on this notion of agency and what that means. Like, how do we really define the agency of an artist within that institutional space when they're invited into it to make a new work? So lots to talk about, I think, and we could have a symposium just about this topic, but we do have fantastic speakers with us this morning, so I'm really confident that we'll be able to tease out many different perspectives on this question of commissioning. Kind of in order of appearance, if you don't mind, in the middle, Larry Smallwood, the Deputy Director of the Sterling and Francine Clark Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Larry will really talk about, because Larry, I mean, in your exceptional career, you have actually approached this process of commissioning from such various angles. And so talking about those experiences will also, I think, make us aware, like, who actually is involved in this process. Obviously, it's not only the curator and an artist, it's many people working either in an institution or working with the artist. Hello, Chicago. Then we move on to Johanna Burton, who recently became the director of the Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio. Welcome to the Midwest again. So happy you're here. And in the bio section in your program folder, you'll see the impressive exhibition history that Johanna has built, but also from various angles within institutions. I think she has worked with artists, commissioning them and working with them to make a work that responds to something. So I really look forward to your talk as well, Johanna. And Trajal Harold, to my right, to your left, I guess, yes, is an artist, a fantastic artist. I'm really happy you're here. Thank you for accepting the invitation, who I think from the perspective of an artist, but also from the perspective of a performer, can really talk about, okay, what does it mean to enter that space, to be commissioned, to make a new work, and to tease out what you maybe have experienced as certain boundaries coming up. Trajal has shown his work internationally. I will not embarrass myself giving the whole list, but most recently here in Chicago, only last week at the MCA Chicago and the Rebuild Foundation, we can see your work, and I look forward to many opportunities in the future of welcoming you back. But huge thanks to all three of you for being here, for accepting our invitation. And without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Larry, if you want to
Sure. Thank you very much.
Take it away. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Larry Smallwood. The Clark Art is not the sort of institution one thinks of as a commissioning agent, but we are currently working on 7 contemporary projects for next year, so I hope you'll all make your way to Williamstown and see us then. It should be quite fun. When an artist and institution get into this relationship of a commission, there's an intent, there's a goal in mind for the artist that really is the most important piece. But getting that accomplished, as Hendrik said, can be very difficult. Getting projects done in institutions, if you work in an institution, can sometimes be more than challenging. So the work that I do and have done for 25 years is generally being in the middle of that. I'm neither an artist nor a curator. I'm sort of an interstitial enabler of work. There's a lot of negotiation, there's a lot of design, there are a lot of spreadsheets, I think, generally, but that's what happens. So I thought to talk about things that also are very interesting in terms of time-based media. Here, this first slide is from Steve McQueen's show, exhibition here in 2012. This work is called End Credits, Part 1. And this was a commission that was part of a 16-object, 14 time-based media piece, 12,000 square foot exhibition of Steve McQueen's work. And this work, it's an asynchronous sound piece. It's roughly 350 minutes. It's every document that the FBI made and redacted about Paul Robeson and his activities during the McCarthy era. It's a very powerful and interesting work. As you know, if you look at this and you've seen Steve McQueen's work, it looks much like his work generally looks. This is a very clean room, acoustically treated. The details of the commission are sort of come from the artist's intent. Always he is very clear. The room should be this big, the screen should be this big, the projector is this, the paint is that. Maurice talked about this yesterday, that there's a very clear direction. What we found doing this show, as I was the exhibition, like an independent exhibition designer and AV designer on the show, what we found when we brought Steve the most perfect plan we could make about how to do all of the works and follow all of the rules and make it all happen the way he thought he wanted it to happen, was the intent changed very, very clearly. And the show really, something really wonderful happened. Of course, we had to stop and kind of roll back because it wasn't what anyone expected, and it never happened in a Steve McQueen show before. But a wonderful thing happened that suddenly all the spaces opened up. We got away from a series of little gallery viewing rooms into really wide open spaces. You see here, 16 millimeter projection on the left, sorry, my left, so the red piece, Catherine. A light box and CRT projection all at the entrance to the show. And this is something Steve had never done before. But in his thinking about the show, there had to be room early on for us to understand intent and then rewrite the rules. And once we understood the rules, everything that follows that's relatively unimpressive and difficult that the people here at the Art Institute did so incredibly well, from HVAC to wall building to operations to everything that needed to happen to get this done, really flowed. So for me, that's the magic of commissions. It's when you understand the artist's vision and then the details follow and the people follow and everything is in sort of a wonderful alignment and you had no idea where you might actually be going when you started. So here's a really sublime and beautiful 3-channel projection surface. This is a triangle. It's roughly 12 feet tall. I don't know if it's 18 feet on the side. Somebody here can do 4-3 math better than me. I know that for sure. But it's something that Steve had never tried before, and we're really, really pleased with the outcome. It was a wildly successful show, I think, for the Art Institute and for Steve. The piece that we started with, the Robeson, which was the last thing on the list, the unknown, sort of rolled into this process really well once we understood what his vision for this show at the Art Institute was. That piece now is in the collection. Jason, the hard drive is no longer made, so I think we have to think about what's happening 10 years from now with that, but I was reading about it the other day. So I want to kind of switch to another project. This has a little tiny bit of time-based media in it, but this is something that has a Chicago connection. This is Nick Cave's Until 2016 at Mass MoCA, where I was the deputy director until last year. And a place that I've worked on and off since 1999 when we opened. Nick's work is, if you know Nick's work, he does a lot of work in sound suits. And he was invited to Mass MoCA to do a 15,000 square foot show commission-based show and not do any sound suits. This is a difficult idea, but really what we're trying to do at Mass Mocha with these shows is to present like a new opportunity that allows an artist to take a risk. It feels like it's not in the middle of New York, so maybe it's a little safer. I don't know if it is, but it feels that way. And to do something different and then support that. There's a lot of fabrication at Mass Mocha, there's a lot of build, there's a lot of people that do that work that I talked about that is work that I do with commissioning. So Nick put this show together. Until is a play on words, guilty until proven innocent, but in this case, guilty until proven, no, sorry, I did it wrong. It's innocent until proven guilty is what we think it should be, but for this show, guilty until proven innocent. I only have it one way in my head, sorry. Which was really, it's an investigation of race and politics and the shootings in America and the shootings in Chicago. And we understood when we got into it that we were going to be doing this massive show and asking an artist to do something he hadn't done before. And I think, our process really worked as we expected, that we would get into this, we would understand that the artist had ideas about the space that we had never accomplished before. Like in this space, a 15,000 square foot space, it's bigger than Regenstein by some amount, at 20%, had never really been filled vertically. And Nick thought, yeah, it's a big room, but now I want to fill every cubic foot of the room. That was new for us, for sure. But we got to a place where the vision and the intent and the budget and all of those things sort of fit together, and we kind of did something that I think we're all very proud of and had a real impact on the museum. The curator, Denise Marconish, and the team put together something that is now touring. It's been to Scotland, it's been to Australia, and it'll open next year at the Momentary in Arkansas, in Bentonville. Sorry. I think that's the final location of the tour. So this work's been out for 4 years. And what we didn't expect, I think, was that Nick really wanted to build. Let me talk about this slide just for a second. So this is, you saw the big scope of the work. This is the small scope of the work. And it's about gun violence, it's about race politics. It's like beautiful in a somewhat sinister way. There are moments, I think we bought every long jockey in New England for this show at Nick's behest. And a lot, Nick's an amazing artist in that he touched all of this. We built massive structures, but he was involved in like the handwork of all of this. It was really kind of a stunning experience for all of us as people, dedicated to making artists' visions happen. This was a kind of an amazing scale. So the thing that was really interesting about the show and new, I threw in a slide for the video, folks. This is 16 channels of video projection that's variable and image mapped with Isadora. I don't know how we do this 25 years from now, and I hope to learn that at some point today from somebody. But this is a work, while it's on tour, it makes perfect sense, but later we'll see what happens. What was really interesting about the process that we didn't expect, where the intent sort of grew beyond what the museum understood or expected, was that that Nick really felt that it was necessary to imbue this work as like a venue. This work was a town hall. The idea here was that his thinking about these politics and these issues and these themes would then become a launching pad for call and response with other artists. So here in this photograph, hopefully you can read the text of who was there. For me, standouts and like really exciting, Bill T. Jones, Helga Davis, I think Solange is in there. So it was a really exciting convening that we did at the beginning of the show, right after it opened, to bring artists in to meet with Nick and see the work and experience it and to have a really, kind of amazing dialogue that day, and some of it very difficult. I think Bill T. Jones really took Nick Cave to task, which was, interesting to be around, about the politics. But this incredible dialogue happened, and it became what we hoped, a launching pad for people to make other work. And about 6 works were made during the course of the year that this show showed at Mass Mocha. The schedule of exhibitions at Mass Mocha is generally 1 year. And so I think I have a slide of, here's Bill T. Jones in a piece that he made called Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea, a call and response. And this was sort of him interrogating what Nick was interested in and what the show was about through the voice of Pip, the smallest and least powerful sort of minstrel character in Moby Dick, at some point reciting the I Have a Dream speech backwards, Yeah, it's kind of amazing. I have 1 minute. Yeah, I think I'm doing all right. I'm close. And so, you know, this work has a life beyond just this one night in this one place. It continues in the world. This was a collaboration that we did with Jacob's Pillow, which is sort of the dance mecca, which is not far from Masmoka. And I have just, I think, one more image, which gives you some detail. This is the amazing Nona Hendricks in her, yeah, it's kind of amazing. In this dress, which is I think this is her transhuman diva outfit. And so I don't know how anyone's going to conserve the media involved in that outfit, but it's sort of, you know, we had these powerful moments that weren't just the museum programming on top of the show or the community kind of involving itself in the show. There were like real things that wouldn't have happened without the platform of the first commission. And that was a surprise for Masmoka, but fantastic. This last year, Trenton Doyle Hancock's done a show, and I think one of the highlights was a Parliament Funkadelic moment in the midst of his exhibition. So there's a movement afoot to make work that also makes other work possible. And as an administrator in this case, and a deputy director, and Masmoka is a very hands-on place. There are lots, I think I did a lot of the lighting on the show as it turned out. But the thing that was exciting was that we were creating a way for people to talk, and we were able to fulfill his intent and his vision with limited resources. This is really not a terribly expensive show, but it became an amazing framework for other things to happen. So this is what's exciting to me about commissioning, is the possibility of things that you couldn't have imagined and that maybe you don't even want to do, being really, really good for institutions and audiences and artists. So,
great.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Harry. I know this is a little bit unorthodox, but could I follow up with a brief question already with you? Because
Sure.
there are so many steps, actually, that, and when you say like this exhibition opened up in ways that I never could have imagined, how do you document that process? Because there's so many steps in that process when you make an exhibition design and it goes to the artist and it opens up again, or do you let it happen and you focus on the end result?
I think we relied, in this case, on the structures already in place, where we have a performing arts department that can do anything from a reading in a gallery to a musical performance around art to, Wilco comes every 2 years and 10,000 people come for 3 days. So like our in-house team does all of that at Masmoka. So we sort of left it to them to manage that. And I don't know that that's everything that an institution should do, but we relied on our given systems because it was bigger than we were used to.
It's an interesting question to come back to. Johanna, do you want to continue? Please, take it away.
I'm super happy to be here. I'm excited to be a new Midwesterner. I've been at the Wexner for 8 months. And I'm grateful to everybody here at the Art Institute. I love this place, and to the two of you for being such great stewards along the way. So as I just mentioned, just assumed a new position of director at the Wexner Center for the Arts, which, for those of you who don't know it, is a really important multidisciplinary institution in the sense that it really committed itself early to the mandate of thinking about all of these disciplines on par with one another. And that's an experiment that I watched as I was deciding what I was going to do with my life. And so it's an honor to be in such a place and thinking about how to move forward. I do think it's quite interesting that on this panel we're talking about commissioning, and there isn't somebody from a major collecting institution on the panel, which is something that I think is also kind of quite interesting when one is considering the role of commissioning. What do we mean by museum? What institutions do, how they operate and function differently when they're considering ostensibly alternative models like performance and film video, which again at the Wexner is its own kind of paradigm because these things are meant to be all considered equal, but you can see a film one night and there will be in fact an exhibition up for 4 months. So how do we talk about that kind of pacing difference? So I have always worked at places by and large like the Wexner that focus on living artists and thereby have no collection. I think there are pockets of these kinds of institutions within larger institutions. I'm looking at the two of you. So it'd be interesting to talk about how those pockets kind of operate within larger institutions and maybe at odds with other aspects of them. Temporality, what are the priorities? My previous roles, and I'd like to think this current one too, I really think about myself as an educator before anything else. Prior to coming to the Wexner, I was the director and curator of education and public engagement at the New Museum. Before that, I ran a curatorial program at Bard, and before that, I was the associate director of the Whitney Independent Study Program. So education is very key to everything that I do, and I don't think about it as a kind of little thing that does the good work on the side, although it often is relegated that way. So I wanted to really take up the role of education in a larger kind of meta way today, and its relationship to this idea of stewardship that the two of you have forwarded as the kind of framework for this panel. So for me, there's this responsibility to sustain and build both ideological and historical frameworks versus just collecting as a sole model of preservation of material practices. So particularly in non-collecting institutions, what one can provide is not necessarily a repository for an artwork or an object, but a framework that can carry forward. And interestingly, a lot of the work that I do in these very forward, future-looking institutions is to build archives. So I oversaw the digital archive at the New Museum. I'm getting ready to build one at the Wexner. I'm terrified, so it's one reason I came, is I wanted to make sure that I sort of got on everyone's radar. But this seems as important to the mandate of contemporary art as anything else, talking about its histories and laying the groundwork so that what's preserved are those stories as much as the performances or works themselves. So this panel seemed like an outlier a little bit from those I saw yesterday. It's not about digital preservation of moving images per se, but it perhaps points to other modes of preservation via practices that provide fiscal support and visibility in institutions which still privilege exhibition practices. Like I said, we try really hard at the Wex to make all these things equal, but the exhibition's up for 4 months. Exhibition cycles, as we know, are 3-month cycles. They're object-based. People are less scared of them. There's still a kind of approachability. But this also raises questions of sustainability. Even with better financial support for artists who work in more ephemeral mediums, they're asked to be constantly performing and producing. I'm looking at Trajal, who may bring this up. What can we offer that allows for career growth and visibility outside of a hamster wheel of commissioned and traveled work? I think the sustainability of the artist is something we really have to think about beyond even the practices. So what is commissioning? As institutions continue to work on issues around collecting performance, moving image, et cetera, it sometimes does allow pieces by artists to enter museum collections. We see people working on this problem of acquiring seemingly ephemeral works. But in many more cases, it simply allows the work to come into being at all. In other words, commissions often just allow something to happen. They may or may not include then a kind of traversal into the institution. So if we're looking for, and I'm using your language here, alternative practices of stewardship, I think we need to look beyond transactional modes of fees for service, though these are important too. I strongly believe in paying artists what they are due, but consider longer sustainability of practices over time. Look at artists like Joan Jonas. She's finally getting a living wage. It's taken her 50 years, right? She never complains about it, but she's hardly rolling in the dough. So how to represent an artist as doing more than pass through an institution, to have a momentary accretion of fiscal or visible value. So again, I think I turn to education and knowledge production here as something that lives beyond an artist's time in or on our walls. By education, I do not mean the education department, but a way of investing in a practice beyond its output through the institution. So a case study, I don't have that many case studies from the Wexner yet that are mine. I could talk about the Wexner all day long, but I did want to just bring in something that I worked on recently. So during my almost 6 years, or actually over 6 years at the New Museum, I did about 20 residencies at the New Museum. This provided a nimble platform where artists evolved projects over multiple platforms. Each residency resulted in an exhibition, though often itself an evolving space with multiple iterations, public programs, workshops, community engagement, publications, public or private research, and then seeds for what they would work on next. This latter point is significant as the residencies often culminated not in a work per se, but in a plan for a next project. sequential kinds of iterative ways of working. I've worked with artists including A.K. Burns, Simone Lee, My Barbarian, Anna Craycroft, all of whom did projects other than they would do if they had just been asked to come in and craft an exhibition. I also have to say my first residency was called Transfer Station. Many of the folks are in this room. Alan Moore from CoLab had a seed of an idea. Kristen McDonough, who's here, Ben Fino-Radin, Maurice Schechter, all helped me, as well as pretty much the entire staff of MEAP. I learned a lot about digital preservation. So Walter Forsberg, Tara Hart, it took a village to do this amazing thing. And those were the kinds of projects that really felt like they were doing something in time. So I will quickly walk you through the example that I brought to show you in depth, which is Jeffrey Gibson, my final residency at the New Museum, partially because he was focused on preservation himself in this project. He called this the anthropophagic effect, and it unfolded from February to June earlier this year. The project took up the famous 1928 Anthropophagic Manifesto written by the Brazilian poet Oswald de Andrade. Many of you have probably read this. It has often been translated as the cannibalistic or the cannibal's manifesto. It argues for counter-appropriation in which those oppressed by colonizers can integrate or devour mainstream culture to their own ends, turning the power dynamic onto the oppressors. For his residency, Gibson, a Choctaw Cherokee painter and sculptor, pointed to expectations that he, a native artist, would inherently possess native skills, which he often employs in his own work, which tend to combine cultural references. Gibson's notion of preservation, which we called inheritance, the theme of the residency that we worked on with him, and one that acknowledged both how things are handed down, you inherit things, you inherit ideas, but also how they're always part of a capitalist value system, you inherit money. How this might help us think differently about stewardship and how artists participate in our institution structures of creating and maintaining histories. So for the residency, he did this beautiful exhibition on our modest 5th floor of the museum. You see some installation shots here. The exhibition was comprised of objects and garments that he made for us using older and recently learned techniques. These are actually from his family's archive. So he didn't make these, these were handed down. Photo shoots with subjects wearing the garments on view were also part of the residency. We brought in an amazing craftswoman from Minnesota who taught his entire staff southeastern river cane weaving, birch bark biting, and porcupine quill dyeing, among other things. You can see Jeffrey in there as well. And we also had these workshops available for community members and some of our youth programs. These are the amazing helmet and garments in progress. And this is another artist, Demian Dinayatsi, who you probably know, a poet, who did one of the photo shoots wearing garments. There were also public programs, Kathleen Ash-Milby and Jeffrey Gibson discussing the history of American Indian House Community Gallery in New York City, which was blocks from the New Museum until it dissolved due to rent. Archives on view, the archives of the American Indian House Community Gallery were on view during Jeff's show as part of our resource center, contextualizing. Glenn Adamson discussed Jeff's work in relationship to a usual history of design through a Western lens. Valerie Steele came and talked about fashion in relationship to this work. And there was a performance called To Name Another, a drumming event with 50 performers. Responding to the current cultural climate, was first performed in Washington, D.C. at the National Portrait Gallery. And then I brought a small clip of The Spirits Refuse Without a Body, a performance activating garments with a live set by DJ Kukum, as well as performance by musician Laura Ortman and choreography by MX Oops, accompanied by Miles Miyake Muglo and Jason Rodriguez, Slim 007. So maybe we'll play that for just 30 seconds, and then I have one closing remark. I'm sorry, my son took this. He's 8. Sorry about that. And so just to be clear, these garments were made during the residency, they were put on view, and then they were activated in these performances and the photo shoots. So they came off view and were utilized during the run. So the last thing I'll leave you with are a few questions. What does it mean to disperse an artist's practice, as I've shown here, rather than collect it? To allow its traces to permeate more than one area of the museum. This touched a lot of different aspects. As we work on alternative modes of stewardship, and as I now have distance to process some of how this work operated within my own area of education, while outpacing the parameters of expectation around that idea, I'm struck by the ways we often ask performance, media, and other time-based practices to operate, and thus how they are collected, documented, and shown. Thank you.
Johanna, thank you so much. Yeah, major takeaways indeed, which I would love to sort of continue to talk about later. Sort of dispersion, but also to kind of rethink the economy of sort of residue as well. And I mean, by economy, I really mean it in an expanded sense, but we can return to that. Trajal, do you want to take it away?
Hello, hello. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here with you today. In 2013, I had spent, I guess, about 15 years in a research and making projects around the relationship between early postmodern dance and the voguing dance tradition. I'm a dancer choreographer. And in 2013, the Museum of Modern Art offered me a residency, which was offered at 2 years, but actually ended up being 3 years, to start new work, because I wanted to change my work, and I wanted to start looking at and addressing the work of the Japanese choreographer Tatsumi Hijikata, who was the founder of Buto. So they offered me this space because Kathy Hallbreck, who at the time, I don't know what her exact title was at the time, but they really wanted MoMA to develop a stronger relationship with artists over a longer period of time. When this happened, I remember some of my choreographer friends saying to me that my work would get eaten up by the machine of MoMA. And I think that as I was looking at Buto dance, which has a lot to do with decay and death, I think that this time they actually allowed us to turn, myself and the curator, Anna Yanevsky, that I was working with, to turn that question around. What would happen if the institution, that being MoMA, got eaten by the machine of the artists? And so I set out to do many things in relationship to this. They commissioned, they ended up, there was no, it was, okay, you have this residency, but there were no expectations. I could design the residency as I wanted. I could perform or not perform. It was really open to how I wanted to utilize this framework, let's say. And they commissioned in the end 3 dance pieces. And I'm gonna talk mainly about one, but I'll say the first one, just to give you a sense of some of the things I did. The first one was a piece I did called Used, Abused, and Hung Out to Dry. And I got permission during a performance to be the first occurrence of all the lights being turned off in MoMA with people inside the building. So this created during the performance an incredible sense of vulnerability and monumentality that was just very special, not something that you can really even, there's no pictures of it, there's nothing, there's only this memory of this moment that happened that we knew was very special. And that became a kind of touchstone for me during the residency as I went on to develop the time there and the work that I did. And so my culminating project was this project. It's a project called In the Mood for Frankie. And this is actually the project later at the Mona Bismarck American Center in Paris. This is the project at Impact in New York last year. We still perform this piece quite a bit. That's also it at Impact. And I had, during my work had been a lot about using the architectural space of the runway to exhibit different kinds of identities, behaviors, borrowing a lot of ideas and influences from the voguing dance tradition and how they use the theoretical idea of realness. But this is also the same piece you can see, and I started to use, make sculptural installation, these platforms, these kind of installations as runways. And this is the piece in 2017 at the Barbican Center in London for an performance exhibition. They did a survey of my work. That's also at the Barbican. But this is the piece, the original piece as commissioned by MoMA. And there were some interesting things about that piece that's special about the commission at MoMA. I was really interested in trying to recreate the original violence of Butoh as an idea. I was not trying to reconstruct this, but I used this as a kind of imaginary proposition for myself. And so I really was thinking, how can I do violence to this building of MoMA? And I think that this was and I don't mean violence in the typical way, I just meant that I really wanted to rethink how performance could be shown in this building and what new meanings could that produce from the fact that it was, in fact, in MoMA and in a building that had a lot of significance or represented a lot of different things for a lot of different people. So I asked if I could do the performance in a hallway between an escalator and an elevator. And that obviously presented a lot of problems because this is not the normal space where performance would be or anything would be installed in MoMA. There were some paintings and whatever on the wall. It also presented a problem because that would mean that the piece would have to be deinstalled and installed every day and night for rehearsals and for all the performances, because this was a living hallway where people walked. So you can see here the installation. Also, we use only light from video projectors. So this was also something that was quite a consideration, because there are a lot of fire codes, of course, about light, and when people, again, this idea of light in the building that I started off with. These are just some pictures of the details of the installation, the tapestries. There was also a trough with water that was supposed to have goldfish. We could not have the goldfish in New York. In London, we could have the goldfish every other day because they have performance anxiety, and the rules there is they could only have it every other day. In Berlin, we could have the goldfish every day. Recently in Zurich, we could only have, I think it was 5 goldfish for every performance. So this changes, really, it changes every place we go. Again, this is the installation. You can see there the relationship to the escalator. More pictures. The other thing which I asked, besides the hallway, I was really interested again in this original violence of Butoh, because there's all this mythology around Butoh and how it began and how it was this cataclysm of sensibilities, and people didn't really understand what they were seeing, but so much it was really in this underground. And I was really trying to see if I could make this MoMA with this very established institution, if I could make something that felt like people were coming to something underground, quote unquote. And so I asked if I could have the performances at midnight. And that was something, because they actually didn't want it to be at midnight because people wouldn't, online, people wouldn't understand what day it was. It would have to be at 11:59. So the compromise was that the performances would be at 11:30 and at 10 p.m. So we were able to do that. I also asked that there only be 50 people per performance. And that was also something that challenge the ideas of because this was my culminating performance of the 3 years, and usually the culminating performance is all about more people seeing it, and I wanted less people. I really wanted again this kind of underground experience that people felt that was very something very special that only a few people saw, and they agreed. The last thing I'll tell you about that, which was very interesting, I wanted no documentation, video documentation of the work. And this was also quite challenging for MoMA because everything that MoMA commissions is documented. I mean, they have a huge archive. And so the idea that an artist would say, no, I don't want you, actually, you pay for this work, you've commissioned this work, you're structuring this work, you're taking it up and down every day, but I don't actually want it to be video documented, was a new idea for them, but they said okay. So these are from these pictures are from the general rehearsal. They're not, as you can see, there are a few people there, but they aren't really, and just to tell you, the video light during the performance, it turns from white marble, the platforms, they turn from white marble to black marble. So it's quite eerie, the piece, and also just this idea of people, very few people get to come to the museum that late at night for something that's not a gala or a party, you know? There was something quite enchanting about it. And I have to say, when I was doing this, there were no pictures of the performance. I realized that I didn't have any pictures. And so right now, there's a Buto conference going on, a symposium, and they asked me about this, and this is what I said. Again, those original Buto performances are not really recorded. They exist in the oral history and in photos. I wanted to see what happened if I too followed this procedure, if the performance wasn't recorded but exists in oral documentation and photos only. This too is a kind of violence. I sometimes wish I could see what those Frankie performances were like, but I also am happy that they exist in this other world and they have to be reached through other means. This too is Buto mind and spirit.
Fantastic. Thank you, Charles. That brings up a lot of really potent topics. I think maybe to start with one question that's sort of something that was occurring throughout all of your presentations is sort of the idea of the social life of the commission. What really is its temporality or its start and finish? And sort of, Johanna, you brought up this idea of sustainability, you brought up this idea of framework, and you were sort of talking about this antagonistic relationship also to the site and how that maybe wasn't reproducible in other iterations. But in terms of these non-collecting institutions, you were sort of speaking about how, you know, we could have a digital archive or something like that to preserve it. Our memory has been come up as a container, as a way to sort of bring out another life of the commission. And you also discussed how the Nick Cave exhibition is actually traveling right now, how it actually became a generative platform for new production in that way. So if we could maybe just talk about the different ways that we sort of see or maybe the ideal scenario for, you know, sort of a second life or a social life of a commission, and to what degree does that need to be or should it be linked to the hosting or funding body?
You mean, by social life, you mean that it has a continuance, that there's some sort of life for the piece. I mean, I think it depends so much on the work. I mean, my work, I love performing, and the first piece I made at MoMA, I really made with the idea that it would only exist there in this used, abused, and hung out to dry, this piece with the light and all that. I knew that I didn't want to reproduce that somewhere else. But most of the work, I like to keep performing, and I think that for performance, I mean, not all kinds of performance, but certainly for mine, I feel like I don't get into the piece until the third year that I'm touring it. And so this is always very important to me that in this commissioning process, which is something we didn't mention, there's co-commissioning. and that institutions work together so that this life can continue. And I mean, it's partly, I mean, I know co-commissioning exists because you need lots of, you need mutuality for the funding to have more money, but it's also so that this kind of life can have, that because of course the co-commissioners will also present the piece, and this gives it automatically even before you present it and then people come to see it and say that they want to show it or whatever, it gives you the opportunity, you know that it's gonna have another life. Like I said, we presented this piece, Frankie, first time in 2016, and we're still performing it.
I find myself often in a paradoxical situation where, like Trajal, a lot of the work I'm the proudest of, people either didn't get to see or didn't know about. When Simone was in residence, she did workshops for young black women that were not public, they were not publicized, they were not for anyone but the group that they served. And they had a huge impact, but they're not documented, they are not on the website. On the other hand, I believe very deeply in accessibility and broadening the audience for practices that I think more and more tend towards actually having commentary on the social field in which we live. Your work does that too. So I really love, I know as a young person living in rural Nevada, reading about a piece was sometimes enough. Sometimes you go and you find the bad YouTube video and you wish you hadn't seen that, right? So I wonder about these ways in which we have an idea, or documentation often defaults to the thing that's the closest to, but there are things around, I mean, people talk about rumor, gossip, and also just straight up old school textual description as ways of documenting things. So I guess I wonder sometimes for this kind of work, if less can actually be, you know, I think about Video Databank and EAI and other places where there's a clip or sometimes just an image from a video because it's not the best viewing condition. And going back to some of these ideas of maybe really best practices that feel like it feels like scarcity, but it might be something else. So I just wonder about that a little bit. And I loved hearing you talk about how you wanted these photographs. I look at them and they're way more satisfying to me than seeing some video, honestly, because you're talking about them and they are these stills. So I'm not being super precise, but I think it's an interesting prompt. So.
No, I was just going to say that when we did this project, I was really interested, although I wasn't able to fully, because the residency ended, to go further, but I still think that oral history is like so powerful. And I think that like, it's especially in relationship to performance, I feel like what people most listen to and believe about performance is what they hear from someone else who saw it. And I think that we haven't, I mean, I think it's super operative in audiences and how audiences, who comes to see performances, but I think as artists and maybe as institutions, we haven't, because we're so obsessed with other kinds of media, which is great, but I still think this this very old sense of like, she told two friends and she told two friends and so on and so on. We haven't looked into it deeply enough, and we don't have the protocols to really nurture it or expand upon it. So it's something I'm really interested in, but I haven't had the right situation yet to go deeper into it. But this was the beginning of it because I felt that this project, I wanted it only to exist in photos in oral history. But then how do you relocate that oral history, and what form does it take for us to have access to it?
In that regard, I just want to say sort of that relocation, because these performances, you know, they're happening in one particular site, and there is this sort of ongoing idea that a commission is responsive to site, responsive to context. But when you reperform that piece, you're activating it in another site where it will have new oral histories. How do you maintain, or how do you even, or perhaps just eschew sort of the relationship with the original commissioning site? Like with MoMA, is it important to you that there's that indexical relationship to that original sort of antagonistic collaboration you had with that institution? Or does that work now become yours and you feel like you're sort of imbuing it with a new sort of rapport with any given site that you're having? Or does it accrue? Or how does that sort of unfold?
Well, I think that because this piece is a performance installation, of course, it has to respond to every space, and it has to respond to the space. This space in Paris with the chandeliers was completely different than the space at MoMA, and there's no way that this relationship between this escalator and this elevator that you can reproduce. It has everything to do with the architecture and the infrastructure in that building. So I don't try to reproduce that, but of course, there is a muscle memory and there is a performance history in the history of, we're still the same people performing it, that we share. And that goes from performance to performance, and that will always be with us. So I don't feel the need to replicate it, but I definitely feel that it's a part of the spirit of the piece, and that's really important. And I think that maybe, I don't know, Claire Bishop wrote about this antagonism, and this was such a, I was really surprised because, again, talking about this machine, because I find, which is something interesting, that talking about differences between visual art spaces, and maybe this is something Johanna could talk about, and performing art spaces. And I don't know if it's because performing art spaces have less money, or they have the infrastructure is different, but they're among us artists, let's say we talk, I always feel that when you go into a space that's performing arts, the answer is always no. Like when you ask something, the first answer is always no. And you know this, and so you know you're gonna get the no, and then you try to figure out, well, if it's gonna eventually, how do you go around it? But I do find that with the museum people, the answer is always, let me think about it, let me get back to you, and it usually comes back yes. And I found this to be in this interesting time in which we're thinking about how performance works in the visual arts. I think it's an interesting thing to think about why that happens as artists, because, and I think it maybe has something to do with the differences between the relationship of the curator versus a programmer. Because often in performing art spaces, you have a programmer. And the nature of that programmer isn't necessarily that they stay with the work all the time. Whereas I feel that when I work with curators in visual art institutions, they're really with me all the time, with the work all the time. And maybe that has to do with why there's that delayed yes, as opposed to the technical infrastructure, the performing arts space saying no first.
Is it also perhaps, sometimes like museums live with the perception that they can be inflexible and are always like performing. That's sort of a compensation a little bit. That has something to do with it, I think. But I think that's curatorially speaking, like, let's say if you're assigned or you invite an artist to do an exhibition or like a performance with, especially when it's a commission, to spend time is so essential, and that is very different in an infrastructure where someone is working as a programmer. So I think that's super true. To Larry, to also like bring it back to you, and maybe I don't want to like sort of adopt your question, but that kind of like social life of the work, Johanna, like taking from you this moments of sort of dispersion, which I think we can sort of interpret and read in so many ways, whether it's sort of moments of sort of dispersion, like a work living on through oral history or living on through an archive that one is building, which I think I also want to spend some time speaking about, but also kind of the future lives, future iterations, if you will, of a performance work. Larry, just to bring it back to the Nick Cave project, maybe you can reflect a little bit on that particular project in light of what has been said about dispersion.
Well, thank you for the word dispersion, and as a longtime theatrical production manager, I've always tried to say yes, but I understand exactly what you're talking about, because that is the default decision, is there's not time and we can't do it and we don't have the thing. I think what I'm excited about, so in my work as an exhibition designer, like on the Steve McQueen show, I could at the time tell you everything about that show, and now I could tell you 80% of everything about that show, but soon I will not be around, and then I can tell you nothing about that show. I feel we archive, and it's important, and there's so much we can do, but it's like splitting fractions. We'll never get to perfection. So I'm more interested, I think, in generative platforms. I thought of Mass MoCA in my entire career there as a generative platform, as a place where things could happen, and now that things are happening and they're having additional lives, that's really, I think, where the power of it is. Extending a show from, the 3-month or the 12 months to 4 or 5 years. Each location that the Nick Cave show goes to, there's a convening of local artists, and there are new works that are commissioned. So there are now, once it goes to Bentonville, there'll be 4 venues, hopefully 6, 10 performances in each one by somebody. So there's real generation happening there. And I think that's okay. And I do think it's okay for things to have a life, for them to make sense. I mean, I understand in choreography, there is a system for how works grow and develop over time and stay with a company, and there's a system in museums for how that works. And I think it's okay for us to be thinking about what we're thinking about now today.
Just as a comment, and then please ask a question. As a comment, I think sometimes it's also useful, when you talk about co-commissioning a performance, and you work with several institutions to sort of pool the money to make a work, sort of a possibility, but also to ensure the life of a work, right? It will go into the world and it will be shown at an X amount of museums, theaters, etc. Sometimes I find that within a museum, people might think they're really unfamiliar with certain formats, and I'm all for thinking of new models, but I mean the sort of traveling exhibition is not so far from it as well. So sometimes it's also about kind of using existing infrastructures that can be actually incredibly accommodating to work that may not have entered that space so much. And I don't know, just kind of like a practical note as we're talking about these lives.
My question is a little bit of an add-on to that comment. When we're sort of thinking about the logistics of what you're saying, Larry, about sort of how other venues have similarly created sort of social convenings, et cetera, if we sort of want to take the language of time-based media and say, are you providing a toolkit or something like that? Is there sort of a template program or something that you're providing these venues for how it unfolded, at Mass MoCA versus,
Yes.
this is sort of, to what degree were you involved and to what degree did you create an infrastructure for the project itself that could be restaged?
It became an addition, an addendum to the commissioning contract with our partners, and then part of the loan agreements with the other venues. It really became a priority for us. I don't think we knew at first, which was the wonderful surprise of it, but it is a requirement at this point. And it's gone well, and I think it's really generated for those other venues surprising kind of waves and ripples. So you just make it the way it's going to be.
Trajo, I have a question for you. Just going back to the MoMA conversation, just for a second, because I think it's an interesting case. Were you, when you were being asked for that, a commission which was really like a residency, right? So you really spend a longer time within an institutional context speaking to multiple people there. Was there an interest on either side, or like both sides, to really document that conversation? Why I'm kind of emphasizing so much, because I think in the space of sort of commissioning, there's so many moments of sort of, how shall I say it, sort of potentiality. What the work will be, it goes in so many directions. And if I look at WhatsApp sort of conversations that you have with an artist, there's 10 works in there sometimes, and 10 sort of versions, iterations of it. How do you as an artist relate to kind of maybe perhaps institutional obsessions with sort of archiving or sort of documenting things? And are you interested in that at all?
Yes, I mean, I think first, this was the first residency where they had someone who was doing performance. I think Ralph Lemon had I don't know if they called it a residency at that point, but he had
the One Sweet Day.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. He commissioned he created other works and kind of showed other works and had different kinds of interactions going on. And I think that no one really knew how to do it, and I think they wanted it to stay as open as possible. Of course, they did document all the other work. They had at the end, they had a major video session with me. I had to go to a recording studio. I think you can see it online on MoMA. And they asked me all about the process, and that was all done. I mean, I think archiving, I mean, my work, I mean, especially because of this Buto work, so much of the work I've done has been by going to the archives of Tatsumi Hijikata in Tokyo once or twice a year. So I do think that it's important when the work demands it, you know, and I feel that, but I think sometimes the work doesn't demand it. And I think that forgetting things is just as important as remembering things. I think that Trent, I don't know if maybe you know the work of Trenti Minha. I always remember in her book, Woman Native Other, she writes about how the story requires all of us to come into being, and there are pauses and cuts and all kinds of things. And so I mean, because my work is so much about the historical imagination, and I'm really, the thing I'm most interested in is the togetherness that we experience in the room. This is what interests me. So this is not something that can ever be captured, really. It's a moment that we share and something we take inside of ourselves and we move with into the world. So the things I'm actually most interested in can't be captured, but I feel that, yes, some of the frameworks around them demand to be recorded and to note it so that we have a path to somehow get back to them sometimes, that we have relationships with other things that come across our paths. But I do, as an artist, I feel that we cannot get so caught up in remembering that we forget, or that we also don't take value, that forgetting allows also for space to open up. And that opening of the space is also super important.
Can I just add one thing to that? I think, and this is a little bit to echo you, although maybe it's just my own thought. I feel like when I go back to archives from the period I studied, there, in addition to there being documentation, there's a whole reception history that we inherit. And we're losing reception histories. People are documenting more and more, but there's less room, or people are taking less room for interpretation. So I feel like now there's more and more raw data and less of a kind of assessment of a field as it evolves. And I guess I wonder, to your point, if for me, that's the part that makes the next step possible, which is you're talking about just being in rooms together and experiencing, but also a critical apparatus that allows us to think about your practice next to someone else's practice in relationship to that history, in relationship to an evolving field. And I guess for me, that's where this question of documentation, to what end, becomes a really interesting question. How is it being used, or is it being used at all?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very good point, because I think oftentimes archives are very hallowed and people don't have access to them, and we have all this information and no one, there's only, you know, you're an artist and then you go and you realize nobody knows about this and you try to put in your work. I don't know, I don't have an answer for that, but I agree with you that how do we make these things accessible when it becomes meaningful, you know, when it can produce new meanings and new possibilities for us. I guess that's why you all are here, to start thinking about that and putting that into some of your practices and institutions.
Well, that's also a beautiful way to open it up to you, actually. I'm looking in the room, not that you have to, but this is a wonderful space for you to interact with our wonderful speakers as well. If you have questions, observations you'd like to share, comments, now is a great time. Emilio, I'll walk to you. Hold on.
Hi, thank you so much. That's a lot of things to think about. I was thinking about when you talked about Jeffrey Gibson's exhibition, sort of the transmission of oral histories and indigenous knowledges, and how much of that archiving is relegated to museums of anthropology instead of museums of contemporary art, and how they've seen even artists creating work now are also shown in museums of anthropology instead of contemporary museums. And there's now, like Candice Hopkins has been doing an incredible job kind of bringing that into Monumenta and other like major exhibitions. But I wonder if there's a way of connecting those two, the archiving that has been done in Museum of Anthropologies and Spaces of Contemporary Art, and if you've thought about that.
Certainly. I mean, I am not an expert, and in fact, one reason I wanted to work with Jeffrey was I was so interested in the way that he problematizes both his own desire to work in that intersection and questions why he should have to do that work. And interestingly, he talks a lot in an interview that he did recently about his time at the Field Museum, actually learning about those objects and realizing they were both his and he had no access to them. And again, these expectations that that's your history. How do you not immediately know it, but having to also learn it? So you may have other ideas about how this works. I think what he does that's so beautiful and that has, I've learned so much from, is he sort of says yes and, right? Like here are these amazing objects that are associated with me, but also are disassociated from me through kind of cultural violence, frankly. And how do we tell those stories in a way that aren't only negative? His insistence on beauty and productivity and kind of messiness in the show was really inspiring for me because he was always sort of saying, oh, here's the part where I'm bringing together a hip hop song that is questionably mine to use, and indigenous history that people assume is mine to use, but I actually have to learn. So to get back to your question about these kind of designations of how things are shown, and often in anthropological museums without authorship, it's all about use value and these kinds of questions and value, obviously. I feel like Candace is such a stellar example of a curator doing that work, but artists themselves, like Jeffrey, who are willing to kind of talk through the tangles. Maybe you have more to say about it, but I get a little suspicious about some of the shows recently that just bring objects from anthropology into, like Documenta, for instance, and say, oh, this looks a lot like this thing, right? So they're the same. They're not the same. But it's interesting to bring them together, I think. So I think we're probably saying the same thing. But I'm struck by how elegantly he can raise those questions without flattening them. They just open up, which is beautiful.
Any other questions, comments, sir? Yeah, let me get to you.
Oh, over here as well.
Oh, okay. Please.
Hi. I think that Johanna brought up something I think is very interesting and maybe slightly off topic for this group, but this idea that especially in a non-collecting institution that we're stewards of ideas, and that what is this kind of shape, what is the difference between preserving an object and preserving an idea? And that in a way we're repositories for ideas that are not necessarily in the past, that they all have a kind of, their ideas collected, sort of waiting to be activated and used and instrumentalized, and that I am struggling with the formats of that because I don't feel like I'm at the Graham Foundation, we're trying to organize or conceptualize our archive, but as something else, as this, so in a non-collecting institution, you really are the kind of, this collection of ideas. And I'm not sure there's a question in that, but I think that that's something that's very top of mind, and I think a lot of organizations are, I think that sometimes in the collection of or the preservation of the object, you lose the things around it, the kind of preservation of the idea.
Yes, a minimal question perhaps, but your goldfish that you mentioned now repeatedly in your performances, how important a role did it play in changing the way the performance occurred as you moved from location to location?
You mean, how did it change to have the goldfish?
Well, I don't know about the goldfish, but how did how did your reaction to it change without them or with them for selected days, that kind of thing? Perhaps that's a minuscule question, but it seems they were important.
No, they're important to me. I mean, I wanted different forms of life. And they make also something very visual on the ceiling when they're there. And you almost don't notice them. And there's something also very, again, I'm going to use this word, and I'm using it because it doesn't make sense, but there is something violent about them, these red goldfish like in the stream that you don't almost notice. And they make you think about different things. Of course, they make you think about life, and they make you think about death because you realize that they're very fragile. And that's part of this Buto thing that I was trying to get to. So I feel like the piece is better when they're the goldfish, of course. But I don't think that it's a deal breaker. I guess I've had to accept that, yeah, that sometimes the goldfish need their rest, and I have to really respect. I mean, it's true. I mean, it's interesting because animal rights. I mean, you know this as museum people, as curators and different people working in institutions, like how volatile this conversation has become around animal rights in artworks, and it's tricky. You know, it's very tricky. It's very tricky.
Thank you very much.
Room for one or two more questions. Alex, please.
Hi, thank you. It seems that a lot of expanding museums are thinking about creating these kind of unprogrammed, neutral, you could say normal black box spaces that have like this potential for new commissions. But in terms of like developing institutional frameworks, I'm wondering if any of you had any ideas about these like museums that want to create a space that's just designated as performance, quote unquote.
Oh my God, I want to say to all of you, like, you don't need to make theaters. Like, it's so, I mean, personally, I think it's so wonderful for me personally, I'm just speaking me personally here, okay? I loved this space last night. Like, this room was so beautiful, and it's like, performance can happen anywhere. Like, this idea, it's nice to have a theater, but it's not necessarily like that produces a certain kind of work. And I think it's really nice to go into the museum where you have different spaces, and you have to, and sometimes it's very difficult because, of course, I do also think, and I have to say one thing about creating these spaces, and the new museum was an amazing, I remember the first time they brought me to that space, because that space, that theater that they made in the new museum had a sprung floor. And for dance, that becomes a bit important because you have to deal with your body, and if you're always on cement floors, you have to be careful because it can really, you can have injuries and damages. So I think we need both, but what I don't like is when then that becomes a space of performance, and you no longer can be in the galleries, you no longer can be in the lobbies, you no longer can be in all these other spaces, and then you just become like, okay, you're in the theater, in the museum. This is not so interesting to me.
I, for one, am quite curious how sort of the MoMA, in that sense, will sort of develop itself now that it has sort of a designated space for a performance. I hope the energy that was in that building, that there was an opportunity to go into such various like space of the building, will not get lost. I'm sure it won't because they know what they're doing, but just kind of as we're talking about that. Johanna.
I just wanted to say, I think it's an interesting question because obviously we want to regard and respect different skill sets and specificities of material specificity and medium specificity. On the other hand, if you put dance in or theater in a theater, you've also told people how to look at it. I remember when I brought Brooke O'Hara to the new museum, she wanted to work there because she said, finally, I don't have to have the theater box around me. People will see the work differently, just by virtue of the fact that they're in a different kind of space ideologically. And she actually refused to have people sit on the risers and turned the stage around. So it was like, look differently. And I thought that was really interesting. And I think that was true for you, too, as you moved your work from performance space to museum space. People came with different vocabularies. So it's funny, I love that you asked about neutral spaces because there are none. But I think that's the idea, that people want to think that's a neutral space. And of course, it's anything but a neutral space.
I just maybe want to make a comment in that regard, sort of thinking about my experiences prior to the Art Institute at the Walker Art Center at a place where, you have visual arts, performing arts, and they're striving actually through a Mellon funded grant for an interdisciplinary way of working. But it's so interesting to work in a center or museum or institution where you have both the venue of the stage, as they call it, or the theater, in which performances are regularly programmed by a performing arts department, but then the Department of Visual Arts is often the one that is producing the performances or commissions that happen in the galleries or in the interstitial spaces. But these things are sort of cohabitating within the institution, often in friction, but in a way that sort of produces dialogue around these ideas of this different ways of engaging and sort of our assumptions, our presumptions around them. How to break down those boundaries and how to truly have something interdisciplinary in that regard without parallel streams of programming, I'm not so sure about, and
I want to make sure that we don't eat into the time of the other panel, so any last remarks that you feel like, oh no, I need to kind of push this in here, or because we've discussed so much, it was such an incredibly rich conversation.
Well, the one thing I want to say to add on to what we were saying about these theater spaces is that in some of the conversations that I've been involved with when talking about the preservation of performance in visual art institutions, there has been this idea that the visual art institutions can only preserve or collect certain kinds of works, and that there would be, like, for example, my big theater works would not be preserved and collected by these institutions. I do think that if visual art institutions begin to build theaters within their institutions, this formula might change, that then they may be able to preserve and collect certain works that are made with the kind of theater regime of the lights and all of those kind of things that are very different than, say, when you're in a gallery. So I think that's going to be interesting in the next 5 to 20 years to see how that develops.
Well, and what kind of different economies, again, enter into a museum space, for instance. That's something I'm really excited about to explore, here, but also to see in the world, which no doubt will have some sort of a dramatic shift, if only because you all are doing the work. So thank you all for being here. Give them a really warm applause, Tragil, Larry, Johanna. As we're building on your comments towards the next conversations here, but also in the work that we do. It's been incredible to share this conversation with you. Thank you all for being. I believe that there's a short break to get some refreshments, and then we'll be back in 5 minutes with you. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and also for getting this room packed of people for the whole course of the symposium. I think all my colleagues that have been behind the scenes and on stage are really thrilled to have seen that throughout all the panels, actually, and not be missing people throughout the way. So thank you all for being here. For those who don't know me, I'm Maite Borjabat. I'm the Curator of Architecture and Design here at the Art Institute of Chicago. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be with Tiki over there, Mark Heller, and Andreas Angelidakis here sitting with me to discuss and introduce this panel about born digital art, where actually we will be discussing not only artworks that have been born digitally, but also unpack artworks and processes that operate into the in-between of the digital and the analog, in the in-between of media, in between of formats, or even projects that exist dependent on online communities, but also dependent on the very physicality of a space. And hopefully be able to at least start a discussion to locate the notion of conservation and how and where do we locate these with works that actually blur every possible definition in terms of media, format, and technology. I'm gonna do a super, super brief introduction of these three big brains that are sitting here with me. But in any case, I will encourage you to read their bios that you have at hand, because I think also the diversity of institutions they have worked with, the diversity of projects they have taken on, and the diversity of roles they have actually performed, it speaks also a lot about this blurred definition that I mentioned before. So the first one that will be started presented is Tiki, who is a contemporary artist and educator, and since 2010 is Associate Professor of Photography, Art, and Technology at SAIC, and working at the intersection of video, sculpture, architecture, and photography. His conceptual work is socially and politically engaged. The second one presenting is going to be Mark Heller, who has worked as a technology consultant for diverse cultural institutions, focusing on practical digital media and web-based solutions to actually facilitate and mediate in between multimedia artists' work, as Jan or Andreas present, and to bring up to speed museums and diverse cultural institutions to be able to actually host them and collect them in some of the cases. Finally, Andreas, as he describes himself, is an architect who doesn't build and has developed a practice that results from violent collisions combining various contemporary obsessions as climate upheavals, celebrity culture, and the infiltration of big data. His works operate in a multimedia and multi-format diversity that crosses also over video, sculpture, virtual, the analog, and mostly every media and format and technique that you could ever imagine. So with that brief presentation, I'd like to hand over Jan.
Hi. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We are not in the place where we are supposed to be in the sense of the presentation. Can we go to the beginning? Ideally not, yeah. Thank you. I will run through a number of different iterations of interactions of time-based media with museum collections, architecture, design, photography, historical objects, ethnography collections, DXS art, hidden and forgotten for many different ways. I want to start with Dimona, my installation from 2007, installation that deals with the existence and the secrecy of the Israeli nuclear reactor. And it's the first time that I used video projection as a time-based light. What you can see is a physical object, a model, with a video projection that is sort of scanning the object out of the darkness. And the piece also has, as you can see in the back, the cutout of the nuclear power plant that the audience is invited to take and build on your own. And so putting into question, obviously conceptually, but also in relationship to how this work is being preserved, collected, and put forward. For me, it was the first work that was collected to major collections, the Israeli Museum, Magazine 3, Stockholm's Kunsthalle, and sort of made me think about the place of the digital or time-based media in these places. So I want to run through a couple of them. This is a piece at the Wadsworth Atheneum, the first American Public Museum, bringing together the largest piece in the collection, which is the house of Chick Austin, the first curator there and ever, and bringing it through the notion of time-based video, the entire sunrise in his home in Hartford. Here at the museum, I was invited to work, to create a work for the Ando Galleries as a part of the material translations, Japanese fashion design, and being in dialogue with architecture or design that is part of the museum collection. There's a piece from the Santa Barbara Museum of Art where the entire museum was going through a change and rebuild due to climate change, and the mosaic that you see in the middle is there not anymore. But creating a site-specific video piece that was eventually purchased into the collection and kept the historical Greek mosaic as a part of that museum. Also wanted to show you, as all of the time-based media is related to light, work from the Berman Museum of Art that was placed in a very lit up space that doesn't actually allow for almost none of the works in the collection to be presented there. I worked with some of the objects and that you can see there that could withstand the light of this space, like German ceramics from the 19th century. But I also came across, and I hope that you can see it in the darkness, these Japanese prints that were collected by the Berman family for many, many years and were never shown, also because of the sensitivity to light, and being able to pull them out and having just a video projection in the galleries that, that lit up with the reflected light and these pieces. I wanted to talk a little bit about large museum collection exhibition here in Chicago, the Museum of Contemporary Photography, where where in a way using the digital image processing was a way to transform and access the projection itself. Here it's a work that sort of took on a number of works of Aaron Siskin to explore there through the photography means. But I also realized that the entire collection of any photography museum is a collection of light itself. And so I wanted to show one of the works that I have created with the museum. This is a collection, video piece that is made from all the objects in the museum collection at that time, in order from the darkest to the brightest, in a pace of 25 images per second, meaning that it runs faster than we can actually see, resulting in a couple of things. First, that in 7 minutes we can see the entire collection, but also obviously not being able to see it at the same time. And thinking about the collection in the sense of light, this video presented in a small room also over the 7 minutes created enough light to be able to see the two objects that were hanging physically from the collection, the darkest and the brightest image. What is interesting in this piece, and also in relationship to a conference or panel like this, that the curators from the museum recently attended a conference on new media that made them think if this piece should be updated every 5 years or so. The museum acquired the piece following the exhibition, so I sort of sold them their own collection. And they're now interested in thinking how this can be work that is can be updated, and what is my place as an artist in this process. And through the work at MOCP, I also realized that it really is one major way to access the collection is the internet, and the place that internet and websites are playing today in accessing our collections or art and art projects in general. This is one of the installation rooms that took into account the existing project Changing Chicago, and I think, can we run to the YouTube now for a sec? That sort of challenged the this ideas of time-based photography through video. Can you play? Yep. And using video as a way to think about photography, things like the decisive moment, that in a way, through the time-based notion of light, started to think about it as more of an expanded moment of a thing. And there are a number of works, and that's a way that I have been using. I have been using video in relationship to photography for many years. Can we jump back to the question? I wanted to. Oops. Can we go back? To show quickly two public projects here in Chicago that. One very recent and one from almost 10 years ago, and think about how the time-based media functions in a public space, and this relationship between temporality and permanency. This is Artes in Horto, a projection on the merchandise mart here in Chicago, thinking the entire project thinking about place of nature in the work of local artists. Artes in Horto, 7 Gardens for Chicago, does originate in many places in museum collections, including ours. And this is Moholy-Nagy, and thinking about what is the value of the work out there and how important it is to access the work and the materials that I've been working with, creating a website and commissioning art historians, like here Robin Childenfry, to write about the place of nature within the nature and the relationship to the city. That seems like something that eventually will stay as a resource. The work was running for 1 year, but this stays and creates a contact for more research, for more resources. That's how you would get back here to the Art Institutes through that. And that's, in a way, really the important part of that project. The second project, the project Cabrini-Green, using the demolition of the last building of the Chicago Public Housing to create a platform for the last generation of people that grew up there to share their thoughts and feelings at that very moment, which was the moment that the very last moment that the public and the media was looking in that direction. And so that was a public work that was happening during the 1 month of the demolition, using light translated sound to light up the building. But eventually, and at the same time, understanding the distance between Cabrini-Green and the Gold Coast here in Chicago, where the Museum of Contemporary Artists, and the importance of connecting these two at the same time. So we had a live feed that was showing the demolition and the lights at night directly to the educational entrance of the museum. The feed from the online feed was something that was accessible online, and creating another layer of audience. And of course the website that until today is an archive archiving the words of these young people that you can access too. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark?
Hi. Great. Hello. Oh. Yep. Oh, so hi. I'm Mark, and I work on the conservation of computer and software-based artworks, primarily at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, where I've been there working with them for 9 years. And I wanted to share 2 recent projects we've worked on in the museum, one from the Media Arts collection and one from Architecture and Design. And this is Hans Haka's News. And it was first created in 1969. It was one of the first electronic artworks to feature a live feed in the gallery. And it consists of a real-time printed news feed on a teletype machine. And a pile of paper grows as it spills from the printer on the table onto the floor. And the visitors are welcome to pick up the portions to read. And news it's neutral. It does not analyze the news, but simply delivers it, spewing out stories upon stories. And at the time, a lot of these dispatches were about the Vietnam War. News was acquired in 2008 by SF MoMA in a new instantiation. There were no teletype networks any longer. And so the new version had a piece of software that talked to the internet, and the news sources came from what were known as really simple syndication or RSS feeds, were very popular at the time. And so in 2018, SF MoMA, they wanted to re-exhibit it for an exhibition called Nothing Stable Under Heaven. And we looked at the software and we decided we had to rewrite it. There are a lot of reasons. The original programmer, he wanted a royalty. The software actually wouldn't run on modern computers even 10 years later. And the news sources had dried up, so we had to establish new ones. This image is a detail of the new software. It's a messaging server I wrote. And as we rewrote the software, we worked with the studio, Hantaka Studio, and what was interesting in this conservation exercise was that we were given a set of criteria, instruction-based criteria from the studio, parameters about how this piece could be instantiated. So for example, the output device could be any printer that produces news bulletins on paper as they come in, dot matrix or other. In case such paper printouts can technically no longer be produced in the future, an LED or comparable presentation could be considered. So it was really very forward thinking of the artist for this work to adapt to the conditions of the time in the future when we might use holograms or telegraphic imprints if they're available. So this was very interesting because a lot of conservation work we do, we don't have these criteria from the studio. And since it's such a conceptual work, there's a very interesting case in the conservation of a work where it's like a pike, you would have to use the same CRT, and be very specific about the components. So this instruction-based type of criteria, we see it, and it's very interesting. It's an interesting case. It's an interesting case of artists to think about how they might guide their software-based work or technically complex work to live in the future. The next one I want to talk about comes from architecture and design. And this was Susan Kerr and her Macintosh icons. Susan Kerr is an artist and graphic designer. She works at Pinterest now, actually. But she's best known for interface elements and typeface contributions to the first Apple Macintosh, the Macintosh 128K in the 1980s. And you can see at the bottom, very iconic, the Happy Mac and the garbage can. They've had impressions on all of us. And so in 2016, along with her design sketchbooks, she gifted a collection of 300 floppy disks to SF MoMA and MoMA. And Ben Fina Radden, my dear colleague, was at MoMA at the time, so we were collaborating on this project, along with the media conservator Martina Heidvogel, who was at SF MoMA at the time. And it was an interesting project. And so in getting the digital files off of these, there are a lot of challenges. Let's see. Floppy disks are what is known as obsolete carrier formats. We don't have floppy disk drives on our computers anymore. If we did, modern computers, modern operating systems can't read how they were formatted, their file system. So that's a challenge. And then one of the last challenges is these files are created in software that doesn't exist anymore. You have to understand there was no Photoshop at the time. She was designing the icons for the operating system that would later have design programs like Photoshop. So very specialized software they wouldn't have access to. So, what were we going to do? And I have a lot more detail, but I have short time, so I won't go too deep into it. But what you see at the bottom image here is something known as the Cairo Flux. It comes from the Software Preservation Society in Europe. And it actually was driven by the games preservation community. But it's a hardware floppy disk emulator that allows you to access floppy disks from a floppy drive on modern computers. It has very good software and a great community around it. So that allowed us to take disk images of these 300 floppy disks. But we still had to read them. So what we did, we made extensive use of emulators. There's a lot of software emulators. This is one called Mini VMAC, and it allows you to run, I think, is it System 7? And so, we had thousands of files, and so we could, emulation is something we use in conservation a lot. And so this allowed us to look at these, examine these files in their, their native or original environment. And there was actually software on some of the floppy disks that Susan had used to design this. So after a lot of trial and error, we were able to get through all of the files, and it was a lot of trial and error, and it was a cross collaboration across 2 museums, which one might think is difficult, but it worked out wonderfully due to great collaboration through great colleagues. Now, I guess the last point on this is access for curators. That's a challenge, right? How do we give access to curators to these thousands of files, in their native environment? You can't, I can't go to the curator at SM Moment, so you got to type this stuff in the terminal and fire up this emulator. So we built a custom server that would run an emulator in a web browser. So all they had to do is go to a web page, and it would just launch it, and they could just drag the disk images onto the emulator and go through the images. And we deployed that at SF MoMA and MoMA, and then we had a shared spreadsheet, so they had a numbering system for all the files, and the curators could collaborate on this. So in this, we created systems of facilitation as well, so it was really great. And so that was lots of fun. And I'll just leave it with some treasures we found. And thank you.
Hi. My name is Andreas. Thank you for inviting me. Is this, should I click something for the video to play? So I started out maybe like 20 years ago by building in online communities. At the time, it was something called Active Worlds, in like the late 90s. And then later on became Second Life, which maybe still exists, I don't know. The problem with these online platforms is that they're impossible to conserve, because the first one, the world we made, the person who was funding it stopped paying the hosting, and the whole thing disappeared. So I was fascinated by this idea of the whole thing disappearing, and in this video, I'm trying to teach a building how to become a ruin, which is something that never happens online, like nothing grows old online, it becomes dated. But also, of course, this video is not the actual experience in that place, it's a screen recording, which is one way that but I was fascinated because I thought at some point these cities, like Second Life, is going to be a ruin too, or I think at the time I was on MySpace, and I thought MySpace is going to become an abandoned place too, and sure enough, or Facebook. I mean, I was shocked to arrive in Chicago and see advertisements for Facebook. Like, why? Anyway, so I in the next kind of world I was doing, after the first one disappeared, this one was called Neen World, and I wanted to make sure that I could keep something from it. So I was making these buildings with materials found online, like homes for artists. And then I discovered the 3D printing. And this was in 2002, which 3D printing was just starting to become commercial. Actually, not commercial. Back then, these companies would, if you sent them a file with your email, they would send you back the print for free. just because they were trying to advertise the technology. And so I thought, this is how I'm going to keep hard copies of my online buildings, and this feels like a digital way to preserve them. So it's not like make a model like an architect, but to have a sort of digital way that goes naturally. And then sometimes I would even turn them into little structures. So the thing about not building was a lie, but I'm Greek, so who cares? This was like a little bookshop in Milano. Anyway, and then the 3D printing idea for me became its own medium. So rather than just keeping hard copies of these online buildings, I started, sometimes they would break too. It became its own medium, and then when the first one that broke, then I decided I'm going to investigate the idea of ruins in 3D printing, which doesn't make any sense, of course. But still, I would make this kind of ruin versions of my online buildings because I was so interested in the idea that these things don't grow old like real buildings do. Real buildings become more charming with time, except when they're bad. And this one, actually, my favorite one, I think. And it was produced by the Chicago Biennial, the first Chicago. Hi, Sarah. She's back there. And then it was in the collection of the Art Institute. So this was a kind of 3D print. I wouldn't say model because it doesn't represent something that's going to be built in another scale. It's its own medium. It was meant to be in that scale. The project was called Bags, Body Parts, and Bibelot. So Bibelot is the French word for tchotchke or commemorative object. This was one of the bags. I don't know if this slide fits in here. But anyway, the 3D printing became its own medium. It started out as a way to conserve these online buildings and then became its own thing. And then around that early 2000 time, I was asked by this new media theorist, Lev Manovich, who had just done a book called The Language of New Media, and he was coming up with this idea of a software cinema, and he asked me for a way to install that software cinema. So I was thinking, like, what's the most simple elemental software for architecture? It's Tetris. And so I kind of proposed these soft blocks that could be rearranged according to the space and according to how the viewers want it, and they would make these sort of amphitheaters. And it only took 13 years for the project to be realized because Documenta came along with their kind of big budget. And Paul Preciado asked me to propose a seating architecture for the Parliament of Bodies. So I kind of brought out these soft blocks, soft because literally they were soft, but also from the word software. And we made demos, which was a set of blocks that look like concrete, but they're actually very lightweight. And you could rearrange them. The people could rearrange them any way they wanted. This is the whole team. And so the space could change every day. And in fact, they did that. They kept, I made like, 50 versions of the space, and they were performing it every day. And now this piece is in Albertinum in Dresden. And that was an interesting thing when, of course, it's a piece that's used by the public, by the visitors. So even it was used for 8 months during Documenta 14, and people had scribbled on it. And so the people at the museum who acquired it were asking me, what do we do with that? I said, every mark is part of the history of the piece because it's a piece that's meant to be used. So don't erase anything. If it becomes unusable or literally the fabric is ripped, then we can repair it. But otherwise, every sort of mark needs to be preserved. So they still, now they have it in the main space and use it every day in like different ways. This was another piece that also, for Documenta in Kassel, this is called polemos, which means war in Greek, and it was a piece that was meant to comment on Kassel being a weapons industry city that's not talked about so much, and it's actually the weapons industry that probably finances Documenta. So this team wanted to address that. Where's Henrik? I don't see him. So this piece, people could take it apart and use it again as seating. And I guess because it was a tank and they did not like that image for their city, it kept being taken apart every day, even when there was no talk. So there's Henrik addressing the Parliament of Bodies. So these pieces, for me, as I made, this was at the VAC Foundation in Moscow. This was in Art Basel, which was interesting because people, both in museums and in art fairs, are not really used to be allowed to handle a piece. When they realize they can, they sometimes go overboard. So this piece that was being rearranged all the time was a kind of, for me as a sort of designer, it was interesting because there's no design involved. I designed the protocol and then people do whatever they want with it. This was an older seating piece in Berlin called Crash Pad with Greek carpets, and it was a kind of piece that was impossible to remake because it was specific to the room, and we had plants and books and all these antique carpets. And so I decided to reproduce it in this soft version. Again, soft both literally and as software in Toronto, where I actually sort of learned that these pieces seem to have a digital agency. They came from the online, and then now it allows people to customize it or to do whatever they want, which I think is digital or online piece. One of the crucial things to remember is that it allows the user to customize and to intervene and to intercept the piece in a way, not just be passive. So in a way, from these pieces, I learned that how to preserve them, but also what you kind of learn from them.
Thank you. So I'd like to open the conversation first to, I think it's kind of like a friction conversation that related precisely with the attitude with the preservation and conservation, that sometimes within the institution we find ourselves in these two opposite attitudes. On one hand, the problematics, as Mark mentioned, of once a software becomes obsolete and a technology becomes obsolete, then our constant need as part of some institutions of preserving and imitating as faithfully as possible these obsolete technologies and obsolete softwares. And on the other hand, actually two works, one that you mentioned, Jan, and one that you mentioned, Andreas, which are actually works that totally resist that attitude precisely by doing the opposite. Meaning in the case of the 3D prints, which is a very different media that is used to actually preserve a different media that it's assumed to become obsolete and disappear. So it's a bit of a meta-narrative, and the attitude, it actually pulls to the opposite direction. In the same way, talking about Jan's project with Cabrini-Green on how a live feed, which was actually the work itself documenting through a whole month, the demolition of that work, and that feed was being made available actually through a live feed, which is per se ephemeral, and then how that actually it's enhancing that ephemerality itself of the moment of the demolition, right? So then we ourselves, we find in those institutions precisely within those poles that are literally pushing us in different directions, and not necessarily in a disjunctive attitude. I think there is a really productive conversation that can happen there. So I don't want to be literally polemic, but I think it's interesting to pull to these two moments of disjunction and hear on your side how you consider these migrations attitudes between two medias actually reflective for your work, and in our case, kind of challenging as a proper attitude of conservation.
Yeah, You know, I'm somebody that I don't care to preserve anything. So it's usually good when a museum acquires something or I gift it, because then it's saved. Because otherwise I would probably like look at it for a few months in the studio. It's like, I don't need that crap, I throw it out. So I'm really, really the bad example of that. And for me, I kind of used that. I felt it was impossible to preserve anything, so I used the notion of, let's say, 3D printing as to make another medium. And then in some cases, like the ones that are in the collection here, they were also using a software that doesn't exist anymore, which was a 3D scanning software. And you could sort of 3D scan with your iPhone. There are other softwares, but they don't have the same sort of glitchiness, a sort of texture that that one has. So I stopped using that software. So that kind of, you know, those prints are not possible to, you could reprint them, but you can't, you know, the software that made them doesn't exist anymore. I think that's going to be something that we see more and more in the future. I guess, I don't know how to answer exactly the question, but one type of preservation that would interest me was the behavior, because a lot of these things generate behaviors in people. Like I feel a museum should conserve, you know, this kind of thing of somebody looking at their phone, because maybe in 10 years we're not looking at our phones anymore like this, and it's like another type of gesture, another behavior. I probably didn't answer anything, but yeah.
Well, if we think about Project Cabrini-Green, as you asked, there was something very organic, how these things happened and were discussed and discovered from the initial idea that this thing is happening just in a public space, in a neighborhood, and that's it, and the understanding that there's this relationship to the Gold Coast, to the MCA, and starting to develop the dialogue with them, with Trisha Vanek. And then having it physically there, the questions of what it is, and there were, as you have seen, these two projections, but also a physical model of the building, and so there was this need for physicality. And then there was the website that also provided a lot of unexpected insights, like when people were watching these demolition and realizing that during the morning hours, we could see on that it was the Chicago suburbs, meaning the people that were pushed out and still had access to internet. And then in the evening, it went to downtown Chicago, downtown New York, when the art community was watching inside it. I didn't expect to have. But when it was over, there were files that were saved on the hard drive as the live streaming was happening. And just a year later, when curator Lily Wei asked me to think about how to show this project, sort of brought me back to thinking about it and going to the files and creating the Project Cabrini-Green feed video that is 700 hours long video that is presented because of the resolution that it was captured, which was very low resolution, on a small security 8-inch monitor running from a hard drive. So here there was this thing that suddenly became not just video, but video that comes with its own monitor, meaning the physicality of it. And to a surprise, it was something that also eventually sold to collections and financed the entire project.
Yeah, on the 3D printing, I have this funny anecdote. We were looking at, if you know Neri Oxman from the Mediated Materials Lab at MIT, she's kind of this rock star of digital fabrication. But they had this structure at SF MoMA that they acquired, and it's a large 3D printed structure, but it was custom substrate made from chitin, which is found in your fingernails or shrimp shells. It's one of the most common biologically available materials in nature, and pectin. And so it's this physical structure, and our students are there, and they're prepping it for exhibition, and we're interviewing them, and they're describing this concept, and it's like, well, these are biologic materials, the most common biologic materials found in nature, and we're asking all these quantitative questions, like what humidity and temperature should we keep it under? They're like, no, it should just be out in nature, because it will go back into nature, and it's the cycle, right? The cycle of these materials in their different forms. And so the conservators are like, what do we do? Like, what are we collecting here? And it was this concept. It was a concept. So we certainly answered some technical questions about reprinting and stuff, but it was kind of this rethinking process about what was being collected, the physical, or this process, this idea that Neri wanted to get across in this work. So.
It's in that regard, going back to the 3D prints, it's actually really interesting how we just mentioned all of that with that definition of 3D prints, but they are operating in very different levels. Like some institutions that are collecting 3D print models, they've decided to actually collect the digital file. So whatever then is put on display is an exhibition copy that you make every time you do the exhibition. In that instance, the 3D model is performing just a representation of that and can be kept. Whereas, for instance, on the situation with those 3D models, they are in fact the archive of those virtual ruins somehow, right? So then in that case, 3D prints as a definition sometimes can come as something that you can make anytime you want, whereas other cases is something that is actually, even if it's a 3D print, it's a unique object in itself, right? And I'm saying this because I think the logic in that is not necessarily the media description, what it's pointing out to those issues, but actually what are the techniques and the technologies that operate in between, and want to highlight that difference because I think that is a mutation that actually both you in your work operate quite smartly, which is what is the technique of something understanding as a set of methodologies or protocols, and then other different thing is the technology, right? And somehow you're both replicating technologies, as in the work of the collection, Jan, that you have some of these videos that are like long exposure, and it's somehow even using a technique that belongs to photography being implemented with a different technology, which is video. And then that really opens a new media description or a new format even. So I like to kind of open the Pandora box of the media description, which at the end is where many of these conversations come through, and how that, and there's a lot of knowledge contained in that, and I'm not sure we're yet equipped to share that knowledge in the way we're doing it just with the media description. Basically I've been thinking a lot with that, with the Cyborg Manifesto and Donna Haraway, and think like how we have been able to even assimilate the concept of a cyborg, and we have been able to produce human cyborg concept, cyborg artist as a definition, and people describing that, why we're not being able to produce the concept of a cyborg media, a cyborg format, or even those definitions are obsolete. I would like to hear in all your cases how faithfully represented you feel or found when those media descriptions appear in those labels, or this way of talking about your work, and so misunderstandings or lack of information that is coming through that. Let's say by now, being optimistic, just a lack of definitions that probably we need to amplify.
And when you say definition, do you mean museum label?
I think we are the ultimate catalyzers and kind of firmly somehow executing some of that, but I think it's all over, like in scholarship, but also in the definition of your own work, or people talking about your work in terms of media format, technology, techniques become quite blurred, actually.
Yeah, I mentioned the museum label as or any label that comes with the artwork, with additional information and the way that how we are as audiences, how we are reading it, and how does it change the work itself. And from the definition of the media, how it is defined, to questions of time and length. I have to admit, I many times lie in the length of my video when we are putting it on the wall, because I know that people, the first thing that audience does is to look on the label and see, like, is it 10 minutes or 45 minutes? Like, am I going actually enter the room? And it goes to all the parts of it, the way that, what your name sounds like. Am I written as a Czech artist, Czechoslovakian artist, Israeli artist, Chicago artist? It immediately influences the way that the audience is reading the work. So I think that the way that we address the media is part of it. I personally sort of gave up in the sense of trying to, and also because it's so changing, right? Like the 3D printing. You can think about the first work that I showed, the Mona, which is printed and it's 3D, sort of a type of a 3D printing. And what does that mean when the museum gets the files? So yeah, it's like ongoing.
Yeah, I was thinking about the museum label as well, because at some point I think with these pieces as well that I showed, I would include the name of the printer in the description of the piece, because only that kind of Z Corp 450 color printer can make that actually texture map thing. And then the contemporary 3D printers, don't do that anymore, because now they're these kits that you buy and you build the printer yourself, and it costs $250. Whereas one of those old prints would cost $1,000 just to make, and now it's like a quarter of it is the cost of the whole printer. So yeah, I don't know if having the file, surprisingly the 3D file technology hasn't changed so much since even the mid-90s. So I still have 3D files that I can import into a 3D program, and they still operate. They're still open. There's loss, but it still opens. So the digital file itself is maybe more resilient than the 3D print, which is funny because the 3D print is a hard copy. But another thing I think that Mark brought up, actually some of these 3D prints are done with non-toxic corn-based materials that would be biodegradable in the right conditions, which is like so scary for museum people. And I pick the materials because I don't want to have something toxic in my studio because I actually make these in my studio. So I don't want to be like melting plastic that is toxic. So I pick the sort of corn-based thing that is potentially biodegradable. Yeah. I don't know what I had to say with that, but just keep that in mind.
Well, I think from a conservation perspective, from the collecting institution, we think about these things. We think about them a lot. And we're doing a big media survey at MoMA right now of the holdings. We're trying to categorize them. It's challenging. It's like electronic artwork, under media. Is it software-based? If it's software-based, do we have the source code? There's all these criteria. I do have to say we've been doing a lot of work around 3D printed artworks. There's going to be a symposium next year, Tech Focus 3, on 3D printing. And we talked to Autodesk. One of the things we're going to ask or talk to you about if we're going to acquire it is, what is the firmware of the printer? Which slicer are you using? Which process? SLA, FDM, et cetera. So there is an acquisition template. Just so the conservators know, can we reprint it? And kind of going back to these, criteria for preservation, and certainly not an interrogation, but it's an understanding to help develop the life of this work or maintain the life of this work. We've also done things just on software. We're like, can we get the source code? That's something you should understand if you collect software-based artwork. You can collect a binary file, and later on you might have to reverse engineer it, or you might want to negotiate, can we have the source code? Can the artist continue to contribute to the source code, which we have agreements with certain artists so they can update it? And recently I've been working with Savannah Campbell de Whitney on VR artwork. So we just released a virtual reality acquisition template. It's very complex because there's so much hardware, so many software platforms, controllers, et cetera. So things are constantly emerging, and so we're like analyzing them as fast as we can, making these acquisition templates and sharing them in conferences and with artists, to help facilitate the collection of these works and the long-term preservation of these works.
I just want to share an anecdote because 2 weeks ago, or a week ago, I think, I upgraded my Mac to the Catalina thing, and then I realized that my ancient 3D software that I've been using, that I enjoy using, doesn't work anymore. And I was like, oh my God. So I had to go through this thing of uninstalling Catalina and going back to whatever the previous one because that ancient software wouldn't work anymore. And of course, I could use a newer one. And I think for kids today, even the notion of using a design software is dated. Like they would find something that does it automatically, or just find the 3D file instead of just making it. But still, that was oh my God, I need to go back to the past.
Thank you. So into that note, I think we'll have a million questions more in our brains. Would like to just throw us a brief summary, probably kind of tasks and challenges that we all here in this room need to face and confront quite directly, as notions again of even definitions and understanding of media, format, technology, and then even in a more political attitude, what is our position within conservation and preservation also, if at the end our role is to fulfill the will of artists and the life of an art piece, what is our position when the will of some artworks is actually not to exist anymore too, right? And that's totally a issue that we also need to confront and develop tools to negotiate with within the agendas of the institutions, but also the bias of the artwork on itself. To that end, thank you, the three of you. I have a million questions in my brain. I think the audience too. I've had already the chance of talking with you, so I would love to briefly open to the floor. So if someone want to share any questions, I know we're a bit over time, but we will eat a bite of the lunch time so we can actually share some of your questions and thoughts.
This is for Mark, but I think it's interesting to think about with the artists at the panel as well. But I'm not familiar with the news work, but can you talk a little bit about the decision-making process and who was involved and the documentation around the decision to rewrite the program, as well as what news channels to pull from and that they're live and current instead of, I'm assuming that the past paper that was printed, the past news feeds were retained and preserved, and why not create the decision around continuing to pull from live news feed or current news feed and not creating software that recreates the same news that it originally was printing.
So to be clear, it was live news feeds. Okay. With the new software, we just had to update them. So the decision-making process is, so Hans Hag is still quite alive, and his studio is quite active in New York. And so the facilitation was through curator Rudolf Freeling and Tanya Zimbardo, the media curators at SF MoMA. And also in the conservation lab, they have an artist materials library. So they had the printouts from 2008. The decision to rewrite the software was kind of multi-factor. The person who had wrote it wanted a royalty every time it was shown, and the museum didn't want to do that. And the software that was written in was just, it was obsolete, and it wouldn't run on modern computers. So we made the decision so that going forward, it would be on an open source software and have a longevity with no royalties. So that I gave the rights to the museum. The criteria I didn't read is that news sources must come from every country and be in English. And so I went with RSS feeds. They're kind of out of date now. It was a big thing in the early 2000s. You'd have an RSS reader. They're out of date, but news sources still have them. So Hantaka gave news agencies. I would test them out. I'd say, well, these are all great, except this one's not in English, or this one doesn't work. Here's some alternatives. And we went back and forth and came up with something that the studio agreed upon. So, yeah. Did that answer everything? Yeah. Okay, great. It's actually running at the new museum in New York right now, but they didn't work out a loan agreement in time. And if you know Dragan Espenscheid, who works at Rhizome, he's their digital conservator. He was like, Mark, can I use the software? And I was like, well, it's like museum business, so they got to work out a thing. And I was like, here's, like an overview, So he rewrote it himself based on the criteria working with the studio. So it's interesting how fluid this concept has become, and what's the physicality of it, because it's just kind of jumping around. But it is running at the new museum right now, and after SF MoMA, it went to the Smithsonian American Art Museum for their Vietnam War show. So it's like a little sprite that jumps around a museum.
I have a question for Mark too, I think. Have you ever come to the conclusion that it's better to literally pull the plug and call a piece dead?
It hasn't happened to me yet, but I'm sure there may come a day. This has come up at American Institute of Conservation discussions. Like someone said, "When's it time to say it should die?" And I was like, and everyone's like, "Oh." Well, we don't want that to happen. So what I can say is, we develop an agency. We develop an attentiveness in our acquisition process, and working with the artists, while they're still alive, to gather as much documentation and criteria to understand the process and these works, to try and not make that happen, but it may happen, and so that's what we're trying to avoid. But I can't say it's ever happened. I hope it doesn't, but it might, so.
Last chance, or there's someone there, I think. Okay.
I think a few of you mentioned collaborations across museums. Can you speak to that in how that would relate to like a bigger institution maybe collaborating with a smaller one, or just in general how that you said it worked pretty well, so I'm just curious about that.
Well, different institutions have different cultures. I mean, we're in California, and I had a great leader that I worked for, Jill Starrett, who's now at the Smart Museum here in Chicago. She was the director of collections, and she really created this model of collaboration. We have team media, which is all the curators, registrar, technicians, everybody around the works of media art that are going to go on display. And then she pushed that model into A&D, and it was all the voices in the room. And I was like, what, it's not like this at other museums? And I went to other museums, like, oh, it is a little different. But she was really about the people. And in larger collaborations over the years, like with MoMA and the Tate, we had the Matters in Media Arts collaboration that was funded by the New Art Trust, the Cramlett Collection. And so that fostered models of collaboration around, there's a website, Matters in Media Art, where the museums came together and developed. We worked to develop standards about how to handle the challenge of collecting time-based media, electronic and software-based art. So there were initiatives, but I think what I found is it is really about the people. I think what made Collaborations at the Moment so great is, we're really tight. We all go to the American Institute of Conservation. We're all in the electronic media group. And we just work really well together. So that kind of transcends museum culture. And I know that's probably not a formulaic response, but it's really worked really good for us.
Great, so thank you. Thank you all, and you're all free to go to lunch.